Hello, hello, hello. Thank you for joining us today on Timely Wisdom. This is an awesome day. Let us know that you are here. Let us know that you are here. If you've not yet registered to vote, I would be remiss if I did not say to you, please register to vote, and don't just register to vote. Get everybody in your house registered, okay? And so, as long as they know how to sign their name, then take a registration a form to them, have them fill it out, do what you need to do, take your whole house to vote. It is your privilege as an American citizen to
Mhm.
exercise this right to vote. And we are in some strange times. And you have some serious questions to ask yourself, not just on the state level, but also on your local and the federal level. So just make sure that you're part of this process. Dr. Bradford, how are you on today?
Well, I'm doing wonderful. In addition to registering to vote, after you register, when it's time to vote, vote. Early voting, don't wait until the end. Go and early vote. Not only vote, complete the census form. We need to be counted because dollars will be coming in our community when we fill out those forms. I think it's important for all of us in our communities because this will last 10 years.
Mhm.
So don't forget when they come to your house, or you can do it online, just do it
Mm,
for no other reason but to put dollars in the community.
yeah.
I think everything else is going well. We just have to do what we have been called to do for this season. Open your ears, open your heart, and do what we're supposed to do.
Dr. Bradford, I believe you have something to say to us.
Wow. When I tell you I'm excited about this
No,
guest today,
I'm not talking about today's guest. You can't see the screen.
what's going on?
Can y'all do a shout out to Dr. Bradford? Tell her happy birthday. God has blessed her another year. Tell us about your birthday, Dr. Bradford.
Oh, you caught me off guard, but I'll let you. Wow. Okay. It was a great day. Showered with love. I felt so loved, so special. To be surrounded with my family and friends. It was even in COVID, I still felt special. So thank you so much for the video and everything else. And everyone that said happy birthday, sent text messages, inbox, whatever it was, I'm just happy to be celebrated because we always celebrate someone else. Thank you. All right, Dr. Burns, let's move on.
Wait, no. We have. Let's see. We have. Thank you, Marjorie Scott, for joining us today, and Thelma Chenault. Natalie, yes, it is a simple process. Oh, Chris
Yes.
Terrell says happy birthday.
Hey,
Tina
Christelle.
Wallace says happy birthday. V. Jean Evans says happy birthday. Sherry Samuel says, "Oh, look at this! Look! Oh,
Oh,
come
okay.
on, come
Okay.
on, come on,
Okay.
come on! Y'all get yes. All right, okay.
Okay.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. You got to pay attention to this. Is Mother Mabry right here. This is a dear mother of my. Yes, look at that. Look at that. So
Yes,
yes,
good to see your
yes.
name, Mother
Okay.
Mabry. In it.
All right. So yes, it's your birthday. Ernestine, happy birthday. Says happy birthday to you.
You
Oh,
know,
come on.
October is coming.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right.
Yeah.
But right now, God bless you for another year. We celebrate life. Celebrate
Yes,
life. Don't worry
I'm
about me. I'm gonna celebrate the whole month. You just try to do one day, but no, I'm gonna do the whole month. So that today we celebrate you. Happy birthday to you,
I'm
Dr.
excited.
Bradford.
Thank you so much for celebrating me. Yeah, thank you. Oh wow. Thank Tina, you're right. Enjoy every moment. And I have done just that. I'm doing just that all month. God is doing a marvelous thing in our lives, and I'm just grateful. I really am. But even in the midst of COVID, I'm grateful. Wow. Thank you, Dr. Burns. You got me. You got me. You got me. You want to move on now?
Okay. All right. Yes. Now, what you were trying to say earlier, tell us
Goodness.
today. We have,
Oh,
oh, this is going to be a hot topic today. Y'all
my
share this. If you've not shared this broadcast, make sure that you share it because you want to hear this. Go ahead. Uh-oh. Somebody says, What's that miss? A
That's
sorrow.
that's
Sorrow. We don't have time for that on Timely Wisdom.
right.
No, no, no.
Tulis, you are absolutely right. That's the season, baby. Oh, Tina, I'll give you the October, but it's August right now, so let's do that right now. How about that?
All right, and this one is from my niece. You haven't had a chance to meet her yet, all the way from Georgia.
Oh,
We
hi.
doing a shout out to you.
Thank you so much for your birthday wishes and your blessings. God bless you. Wow.
And
All
she
over
just
again.
started theological studies. I'm proud of you, niece. Go ahead.
Oh, wow. That's wonderful. Yeah, it's about to be on. Uh, Come on, Sora Tulis. Yes, ma'am. Okay. You know, that are we done with this now?
As long as we don't have no more of that crazy sorrow or whatever all that other stuff is. Go ahead.
Wow, I'm excited about today. This is an incredible, I guess, a burning question that a lot of people ask, but should women preach?
Mhm.
And we got the right one in the room today. I tell you, Reverend Dr. Shively T.J. Smith. She's a scholar, a professor, a speaker, author, friend, mother, wife. I mean, she's just an all around person. She serves as an assistant professor of New Testament at Boston University School of Theology. She is dedicated to extending academic theological studies and interfaith and ecumenical conversations into the public square. She has appeared on the History Channel documentary, Jesus, His Life, and presented at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. She is the author of Strangers to Family, Diaspora, and First Peter's Invention of God's Household. She has contributed to the multiple writing projects and series, including Feasting on the Gospels, Reading and Writing Theologically, and Connections, a lectionary commentary for preaching and worship. She is a regular contributor to the online Working Preacher Lectionary, that's right, series, the Odyssey Networks on Scripture online series, and Odyssey Impact campaign, Sojourners Online, and a church blog. She is a frequent commentator on the Reese Taylor documentary. The Rate of Reese Taylor. That's the documentary that you really want to see. It's horrific, but I tell you. And the Howard Thurman documentary, Backs Against the Wall. Currently, she is a 2021 teacher scholar of the Calvin Institute. She's an ordained itinerant elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She proudly serves as member and resident scholar at the historic Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C. Come on and welcome this powerfully gifted woman of God, scholar, mother, wife, sister, friend, to the Timely Wisdom Conversation. Hey, how you
Oh,
doing, Dr. Smith?
I'm doing well. So glad to be here. Happy birthday.
Yeah. Okay, all right. You in on it too. Okay. When I tell you I'm excited about this conversation, you are a New Testament scholar. And most people, a lot of people that you hear about, I don't know, women shouldn't preach.
Yeah.
Women shouldn't be in the pulpit. Nope, they need to be having babies and barefoot.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, and cooking.
Right.
So when we look at the scripture, how do we get that women are not supposed to preach? Can you help us with that?
We need to have some conversations about that.
Come on.
So the probably the best way is just to answer the question directly, and then we can spend time
Let's unpack
unpacking
that
it.
thing.
So the question is, should women preach?
Yeah.
The answer is, if it was good enough for Jesus, I don't know why it's not good enough for everyone else. So the answer is yes. That um that we have to make so and I really do mean that. I mean, I'm not even being playful. I mean,
Right.
so one of the first things for me that I think is important to do is to make a distinction between sort of the traditions and histories of humans and really the gravity and the transformative nature of what it means for us as a people of faith to truly subscribe to the notion that we serve a resurrected and living Christ and Savior
Yeah.
who in his living prior to the crucifixion was crucified, because in his living he was already living and organizing around a transformative way of bodies being active and present in the world. It was so radical. It was such a challenge to the status quo, to the ways in which the people and the systems and the institutions worked, that they solved the problem by executing it. Right. So in his living, before we even get to the resurrection, you have we are proclaiming from Sunday to Sunday, believing in a Christ who in his living did things that were radical and that made people uncomfortable in ways that they either opened up to what is possible and how we relate to each other and what we can do in the name of God, or they shut down and tried to find ways in which to what? Kill it, destroy it, police it. Things that I don't know, maybe might look a little bit recognizable to us now. I'm not sure. Right. So there's that. But on the other side, when you deal with the resurrection moment, the proclamation of life, that life conquers death, the first people that receive the message, hear the message, confirm the message, and then carry the message are women. In the vision and in the work of the gospel, of the good news, women, we are the first carriers of good news. So we're not just talking, when I talk about can women preach, I am talking about women as carriers of news that brings life to people, that brings new creation to people. So my first answer is yes. If it was good enough for Jesus, I don't know. I do not know why it's not good enough for everyone else.
Dr. Smith, let me ask this question, and I know that there is someone who's listening, either directly or indirectly, might hear us now, might hear us later. There's always this passage of scripture. You're a New Testament scholar, you're a professor, you teach, you write. There's always this passage of scripture that says, well, Paul says women ought to be silent in the church. Okay. Tell us about this as a New Testament scholar. Talk to us.
Oh, so I am a New Testament scholar. I am a preacher. I am a daughter of the church, and of more importantly, I'm a sister in the faith. So for me, all of those pieces work together in terms of even how I read and talk about the scripture. So I'm saying that as a caveat, as a sort of setup for that. So my first thing is I don't worship Paul, I worship Jesus. So that's the first thing. So the first thing I have to do is, Paul is useful to me to the extent that Paul becomes a mouthpiece, a writer, a vessel that has been used and codified. So we've got him in scripture for me to think on the things of God that are said in the writings that were written 2,000 years ago, and that were not imagined by humans, could not even be captured in ink, because God's ways are beyond our ways. So do I think that Paul imagined 2,000 years ago there would be this African-American woman from Kentucky, first generation, go with degrees, who goes to college, who goes across seas? There's no way in the world that Paul saw me in his mind's eye when he was reading. But that doesn't mean that God and God's spirit didn't. So there's a way in which, so when people come at me, first I say, well, I don't worship Paul. I worship the living God, and Jesus, who didn't stop revealing God's self and didn't stop doing marvelous and magnificent things once Paul put his pen down. If Paul wrote the letters at all, that's another. You have to invite me back for that conversation. So the first piece for me becomes the issue of revelation for you. If we really believe that God is the living God who is living not just in the black and red ink that we have in our Bibles, but all around us, then surely we can't actually be saying that the only thing that God can do and has ever been able to do is what he did 2,000 years ago, and there's no new forms of that. So there's that. The second thing is when we start talking about Paul and what Paul is dealing with, Paul is navigating a different dynamic than what you see with Jesus navigating. So Paul, when he writes, so let me just, as the Bible scholar in the room, Bible scholars, when we look at, so the New Testament is written in Greek. Jesus didn't speak in English. Paul didn't speak in English. So you got to do the translation game. We do not have the originals of any of the writings of the New Testament. We do not have the copies of the originals of any of the writings of the New Testament. We do not have the copies of the copies. We are dealing with reconstructed Greek text. Before they even make it to your King James or NRSV, it has to come through a scholar like me who has to put the pieces of the text that we have together in Greek and then translate them, which means something. What it means is, I'm going to tell you that most scholars are going to recognize that we actually think that that's a later addition, that actually wasn't something that was penned by Paul, that becomes what we call an interpolation. Is something that was added by scribes later on down the line who are receiving these texts. And what are they doing? They're copying them for their congregations to go out by hand. And so that's added there. That's important, actually, because again, you see how I made the distinction between tradition and what Jesus said.
Yes.
And what we're clear about is in the very earliest forms of the Christian church, as you see captured in places like the Gospels, as you see captured in a place such as Romans 16, when Paul is talking about Phoebe, which we can get back to her because that's one of my I love her. But we see clearly that there is a deep history at the very beginnings of our faith of not only women's presence. We're not just cooking and having babies and sitting in the kitchen, that we are also students and disciples, that we are in the rooms, not on the sidelines, right up close, involved in the learning, in the teaching, in the sharing, in the healing, in the proclamation of our faith. From the very, very beginning, women were present. Now, let me, as a person of color, I'll take it even a step further. Not only were women present with agency, power, and voice, but how about this? Slaves were present with agency and voice in the same way that the master class, those who supposedly owned them, had agency and voice. This is important because you see that as what's going down in places such as 1 Corinthians 2. So when Paul pulls out the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11 and starts talking about what it means for us to come together, he's not just talking about the Lord's Supper. The issue is that master class that's Christian, they would sit down at the table and have a full meal in the name of Jesus. But goes and then tell their sisters and brothers who are of the servant class that they have to wait because this is how the world works, right? And that they get the crumbs. And Paul goes off in 1 Corinthians, like, wait a minute, there's no weak and strong. There's no, everyone sits at the table together. You don't leave the crumbs from your, in fact, because you are full, you're supposed to get up and make space. So that's what I mean about this reversal of power, reversal of roles, and what's transformative. So at the very earliest parts of our faith, women had voice, presence, and I'll make it even contemporary for us right now, had vote in the community. Just like you want to talk about, sometimes it's easier for African Americans, whether men or women, to deal with the fact of, slavery, slaves and servant class have presence, power, and vote, which is radical in an ancient world that is built on hierarchies of master, servant, male, female, these classes. You don't see that. Now, that interpolation from Paul that people see is it, and stop me, Dr. Bradford, I get on a roll, so you can stop me. I hit Paul.
Keep rolling.
But that interpolation, if indeed it is a later addition, which, so as the doctrine room, I'll say it is, comes from a period when the church is beginning to encounter, and this is like after Jesus, after the first disciples, is beginning to experience the pressure that comes from communities that are in societies that don't like gatherings to be different from their status quo. And so the church begins to what? Accommodate. It begins to model itself after the social norms and caste systems of the world in order to do what? In order to create what? More symmetry, in order to lessen the tension, right, and the clash, in order to make it safer for them. And one of the ways in which they begin to accommodate is that they begin to what? Say, okay, women, you've got to have a place, because why? That's how the Roman world works. Servants, you have a particular place. Why? Not because that was Jesus' plan, not because that's the Christian faith's plan. Those are the concessions and the compromises the institutional church is making in the second and third and fourth centuries, so that it can what? Ensure its institutional survival. And then it does it so well that by the time you get to Augustine, they're at the center. They become they're able to become the religion of the empire itself. That didn't just happen. The church made the accommodations it needed to make, even compromising some of the basic proclamations that made it transformative and life-giving to begin with in order to do that. And that was and so that becomes sort of part of our what we inherit from that. So that wasn't Jesus' plan. That's human beings' plans for trying to figure out how to preserve their institutions. Not only preserve them, but to make sure that they have power. And one of the first things you do is you unseat those who people are not used to having power.
Yes.
Right? But that wasn't Jesus' plan. That wasn't Jesus' plan. And that wasn't Paul's plan. Paul was doing the same thing in the Corinthians. When you do a First Corinthians, he's dealing with a church that is already, church. So factions. He's dealing with a church that's threatening to divide. Paul is at all times, across all of his letters, is committed to preserving church community and unity. And so he is making calls on the fly, pastoral calls on the fly, in order to keep the church keep the church together. I don't fault him for that, because that's what leaders do. We make decisions on the fly, and we hope and pray to the Lord that those decisions are going to not only give us the outcome that we want, keep the people together, but that it doesn't shut down other possibilities, right? It just it allows us to get what my grandmother would say, a little bit more down the road, right? A little bit more down the road.
Right.
So he was making a call that was responding to the fragility of the community in First Corinthians. Now look at this. When you go to some place like when you flip the text and go to Second Corinthians, you turn around and found out that Paul got his feelings hurt. So First Corinthians, he tried to keep the people together. Second Corinthians, if you read it, that's a whole lot going on there too. But if you read it, you end up realizing Paul went there. Those people hurt his feelings and sent him away crying. They sent Paul away crying. So I always think it's real. So part of it is. So I will say this to people. I am a Bible scholar, a New Testament scholar, because I think there is so much drama and so much to the story about what it means to be people of faith that we miss. And I think that I find it exciting to reread these texts and recognize these are people that are negotiating their relationships, their power dynamics. How do they relate to each other? How do they relate to God? How do they relate to a world that looks at them with suspicion? And it is very hostile to anything and to anyone that is deviant from the status quo. They are making decisions about how to stay alive, not as individuals, but as communities. And one of those decisions that you see Paul making when he is forced to have to make some decisions in order to ensure preservation is to talk about shutting down the voice of women. But what's important there, and then ask me another question, is to recognize that the reason why Paul wrote that It's because the women weren't doing that. The women did have voice. They did have agency. They were saying something. So he wouldn't have written that if the reality wasn't that the women had in place. And that didn't just happen. That was a part of the culture and the identity of the Christian faith to begin with. And what ended up happening was power started changing, generations started changing, the outside world started paying attention and putting pressure on them, which was contributing to some of the divisions. And Paul had to make decisions about how to remedy that. That's a long answer.
Oh no.
So
I thought you were going to keep going, because it's definitely true. And then I think that it seems as if we adopt those same behaviors.
Yeah. I think
just go ahead.
Yeah, I think that that's probably the most unfortunate piece is we adopt the behaviors of compromise, the behaviors of accommodation, and we miss what that our faith really does call us to. What I like to talk about a sort of a holy courage, and a faith-filled deviance that is supposed to make people uncomfortable. So I recognize that I can make people uncomfortable, right? Sometimes I'm not intentionally, Dr. Bradford, you know me, I'm not intentionally trying to show up in space to make anyone uncomfortable at all. But at the same time, I also recognize that there is something to standing in a space and speaking a truth, speaking the declaration about what it really does mean to say that we are all wonderfully and marvelously made in the image of God, male and female, right? And that we all have a testimony to say, and that we all have an authority and a power that is in us and around us. That God is almost like God and the spirit of the ancestors are just waiting for us. It's almost like I always say, they're not waiting to take hold of you. They're waiting for us to take hold of them, right? God's spirit's waiting for us to take hold of her. And the ancestors are waiting for us to take hold of them and to catch hold of what it means to think beyond what you can imagine or think. So, and the biblical text shows us the power of that. The power of that is when all of a sudden we have a bigger vision, and then the 5,000 gets fed, and then the 4,000 gets fed. And even though you were just there in Mark 6 and he fed the 5,000, now you're in Mark 8 and you still don't think Jesus can feed this little 4,000. So while everybody is still catching up, God is still saying, come on now, we on this thing. I mean, like what it means that people can be healed who are sitting there and have been sitting on the road the entire time, people telling them to be quiet. Like there is something very profound and powerful about catching the vision of what the good news really is about. And these power structures that silence some while empowering others is not that good news.
Empowering others or discrediting others or saying or separating others. Okay, if we could just be one and work toward the same goal, how many people will be impacted?
Yeah, and I impacted, and I think that there's a danger. I mean, so one of the things that in biblical studies, when we talk about that, the Luke Acts, so the tradition of the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts, we tend to talk about them together as Luke Acts, so that Luke, the same author, wrote the Gospel of Luke and wrote the Book of Acts, even though they're separated by John. Most biblical scholars recognize that we actually should read those as two volumes of the same project.
Right.
So I'll talk about it in shorthand as Luke Acts. And Luke Acts is considered in some circles has been called the sort of the gospel of women, because it's together. You see more women active there. You also see Jesus interacting with poor people. You see Jesus interacting with sick people in a real way. And when I say interacting, I'm not just talking about saying, hey, Jesus. So I always tell people, so Jesus was like the party person. So he would show up. And so part of the big, I always laugh because I go, so part of the big tension in the Gospel of Luke in particular with Jesus is not just that he has these women around him. And it's not just that he has poor people around him. And it's not just that he has sick people around him. He does. But they're around him and they are all eating, which is good for me and my Kentucky, Georgia self. So Jesus would sit there and be with these people that are supposed to not have voice, not have agency, not be included in community. Not only would he include them, he would sit and have a meal with them, to the point that he got called a glutton. Like, all he does is eat with these people. Table fellowship in the ancient world, especially at the level that you see Jesus, that's like party time. So I always say, so, he's not just sitting there having this like china laid out meal. They're up there like kicking it. So Jesus, even in how he, like, where he found relaxation was by creating space and safety for people to be heard, for him to engage. And he, to the point that he was, he bothered those that were looking outside. So you see this ethic take off in the book of Acts when you start talking about they shared all things in common. Acts 2, 3, 4, right? This sort of sharing all things in common, all things being equal. But that was already started with Jesus and his habit of eating with everybody and hanging out with everybody. So we have, before you get to Paul, my point is, what is the vision that you see being cast around the good news that Jesus is proclaiming and embodying, and the good news that you see the early church embodying? Now, the danger of this is, as much as we have all of these sort of testimonies and stories throughout Luke, Acts that talk about this in such glowing terms. I mean, you think it's phenomenal that they're all sharing things in common. They're praying together, they're eating, they're making sure everyone is taken care of. People are heard in many ways. But then the dangers happen, right? So you also get in Acts the stories of people being executed, right? So you hear about the executions, you hear about the deaths, you hear about the imprisonments, you hear about the ways in which they're even falling out with each other at times.
Yes.
I mean, in real ways. You hear about the facts that they would come together in space in Acts 15, and these would not be easy resolutions that they would come to in terms of how to include. These would be really intense debates and conversation. Yeah. What does it mean to think about our faith as having space for debates, for intense conversations, in which we are all on different sides, and yet we're supposed to find a way to talk to each other, to reason with each other, to acknowledge each other's humanity, to give voice and platform to each other in a real way. So the challenge is in the fact that these are not easy wins that can happen. And certainly not when we deal with, for some of us, back to the issue of can women preach, when we deal with the fact that some of us are shaped informed by, in our faith, by traditions and spaces that have told us and continue to tell us that women's place isn't to lead, women's place isn't to preach, women's place isn't to pastor, women's place isn't to be in the front. And I always say, well, women's place isn't to be that. Is that according to you? Or is that according to Jesus? Or is that according to Paul? I mean, like, even, and if you go to Paul, I say, well, I don't, Paul ain't my savior. So that doesn't work for me. Right. And so there's a real way in which we have to analyze how sometimes our resistance to what I would talk about as sister leadership and sister voice actually may not be what's in the biblical text. It may actually be cultural and traditional. It is how we have been formed to think about ourselves and each other, and to recognize the good news is that we can break out of that formation. We are at all times, as people of faith and women of faith, catching up to God and God's spirit. We can never, ever, ever outrun God. God, the spirit are always ahead of us. So what does it mean to recognize that we are, even today, we are still behind God, and the spirit is telling us, come on now, come on. So to really enter our faith with a sense of humanity, humility, and to recognize when Jesus resurrected, the first folks Jesus appeared to were the women, and to ask the question, why?
Yeah, why?
You want me to answer that question?
Come on. Why? You mentioned creating space and safety for others. How do we create space and safety for others? And I won't just say the men, but the women. Since we've been indoctrinated
Yeah.
under this culture that says, okay, women shouldn't preach. And you have men that are opening up and saying, okay, I have a voice. I want you to be here. But you have the women that say, no, me and no more.
Yeah.
So how do we create a space and safety? I would say a space of safety that will invite others in to do the same as what God has called you to do.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I am not a life. I am not. Always son. I'll say this. I am not a legacy AME or a lifelong AME. Right. So this is actually important. To your point.
Yeah.
I love being AME. Don't get me wrong. So AME Church keep me because I'm in. I'm very happy where I am. So just want to say that. So, but I am a PK and a grand PK and a niece PK,
Yeah.
primarily Southern Baptist pastors and ministers and deacons, right, and then Pentecostal. So I've got these two strands that have very clear commitments as a young child for me of what it meant that women definitely didn't preach. They didn't even pray if a man was in the room. So I mean, there's this very strong formation that I recognize that I loved. I mean, I loved singing in the choir. I was that child that loved singing in the choir and loved the pageants. And I mean, I thought that was wonderful. Right. So there's a way for me. So I'm saying all that to say that I think a lot of us that have been formed in ways by faith and by faith communities that, yes, have brought us life and continue to bring us life. But there are also ways in our formation and places in our formation where human imagination, human fear, human just didn't know better. Like, like in some ways, those limitations are things that we are constantly having to talk back to. So I always think that we are recovering. We like, it's almost like you gotta have an AAA group for us. Like, so you are always recovering in some ways from those limitations, which I think is part of what it means to have a vibrant faith. Like that. I mean, if you ever reach a point, so for me, one of my goals, one of the things I work really hard at is I never want to reach a point where I wake up and I'm writing about the biblical text, or I'm preaching about the biblical text, or I'm teaching about the biblical text, and I say, today I have learned everything. I know everything there is to know about God and God's ways. Like, I mean, there's a way in which really every day living with the recognition that there is something in this day that 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 may present itself so that I can once again be in awe about God. Like, God, I didn't even think about that. Like, I never, wow, to have a wow moment like that to be on this journey with a faith is to constantly recognize that I am always in awe because God is not confined by my limitations and my imagination.
Let me as to a continuation from Dr. Bradford's question, and I see Kimberly Rossa said this, and she says there's something to be said for women who act as proxies for oppressive patriarchy. I guess in that statement, but then also I continue to marvel at how the Black church, which is, quote, always fighting systemic injustices, but yet finds a way to continue its own system of oppression within it, while at the same time declaring that it is a liberating force.
Yeah.
And so, yes, so kind of in light of what Rusa has stated, but then also what has occurred, and when I say the Black church, I mean the American Black church. What has occurred in our own kind of psyche that we continue to put in, we continue to oppress while we claim we are fighting oppression?
So I'm going to be historical for a minute and back and come from that. So one of the things that occurred is we did the same thing that the church did with Rome in some ways in our politics of respectability. So when we began to construct our institutions, our own independent, particularly I'm talking about Black church traditions, right? We constructed our own institutions by mirroring the structures, and a lot of times the structures and values of the dominant institutions that we were setting ourselves apart from, even while we changed the focus to our communities, right? So again, I say that this isn't necessarily these. When you talk, so let me unpack a little bit more what you're even saying. When we even talk about Black church traditions, being liberating and addressing systemic problems. Yeah, we address systemic problems related to particularly race and class issues while maintaining very much the patriarchal structures, not of our communities, but mirroring that from the dominant communities. And part of that was the politics of respectability. So we were doing the same thing, right? We were accommodating so that our institutions can be respected. Our institutions can be seen as valuable institutions contributing to our community and our society. So it was sort of a way in which to sort of say, we too are civilized. We are, and be clear, there's a reason why this response is happening. Why? Because brown bodies are coded as being uncivilized, as savage, just not having respectability, not having politics, not being human. So one of the ways in which we begin to counter that is creating institutions that affirm our dignity and humanity, while also in some ways mirroring some of the values and structures from the other side, so that they can also be. So this is a piece people underestimate, so that they can be familiar, right? So that they can see them and say, "Oh, okay, they have church too." I mean, so there's a whole history of how our institutions were making some of these decisions. Again, making decisions on the fly. I mean, this is what Paul, like I said, where I started. What Paul is doing. So I actually am not the scholar. I'm not the person that faults that history. I am the person that says, so okay, we've done that. Right here, because this is a problem. And I think that issues of sexuality and of gender, patriarchy are still major challenges of our institutions now. But those are not challenges of the gospel message. Those are challenges of what that we are creating and that we are nurturing and sustaining for as one human being to the other. So I like to separate that. That's a human challenge. That's not a good news challenge. That's not a gospel challenge. That's not a spiritual challenge. That's the challenge that we have. If I'm going to talk particularly about Black sisters in this space, what we have in terms of taking care of each other and validating each other's God-given gifts and roles in the work of God's creation. And so we need to do a little bit of work on what it means to be really sister friends in the journey. Whether we are in the front of the pulpit, whether we are in the choir stand, whether we are sitting in the pews, whether we are the CEO or the doctor in the medical center, like what are we doing to take care of each other in religious institutions and in a society that does not have a long history nor a good track record of caring about the gifts and callings and graces of us, though can none of them make it without us. They've never been able to make it without us. So there's a way for me that when we talk about can women preach, it really is, can we take care of each other as preachers and as teachers, as leaders and as people? Can we lead and demonstrate in our Black churches what it means to share all things in common by first and foremost finding commonality with each other across our many roles?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Get to the table.
Yeah.
Get in the door, get to the table, and leave the door open behind you.
Yeah. And I don't think the brothers are off the table from this. I mean,
Oh no.
I think
Okay.
um
We
We have
we
three
have
questions actually.
three questions to throw at you
oh good.
from
Go.
our viewers, and I'll just put them up. And the first two, and then the third just came.
Oh yeah.
That's
Factor the power of patriarchy from yeah, that's what I was going to
okay.
say. So
And then this one,
what are
I
we
think you're.
doing to take care of each other?
And here's your third question.
Mm-hmm.
The future of the gospel message and human. How might 21st century interpreters of the text identify which is which? Right. All right. So let me deal with the first one, which is the patriarchy question. So yeah, so I was going to say I don't think the brothers are off the hook on this. That I would say so I have really good, friends, I mean, of all type. And some of them, particularly the brothers, will say, so you're not off the hook, right? Like that you have a responsibility to, again, we are all recovering from our formation. So even the most enlightened, well-intended brother in the pulpit who's like, I don't care what these people say, you are the pastor, you are the preacher, they have blind spots, like, and they have to own that. And so how you own that is, again, one of the big things I always talk about is proximity. Is you invite sister preachers along with you who can I'm kind of being funny, but maybe not. So I'm gonna just give you who can probably out preach you and out teach you on the text, maybe. Like, instead of being insecure about it, you invite them along with you so that when you do something that sort of pulls back into that patriarchal stuff, you actually intentionally didn't realize and don't know it because you just don't know it. You guys have a proximity and a relationship of trust enough that the sister could pull your coattail and say, so that was some sexist stuff right there.
Right.
And I said, no, it wasn't. So yes, it was. And what my mother tells me sometimes, you gotta get a little courage about yourself, sisters. But you can do it in love. I'm not talking about, I'm talking about saying, so that was a little sexist, right? And let me show you how. And you help the blinders be taken off. We help each other in our new formation of each other, right? And I think that that's part of it. So part of it is we cannot do the work of what it really means to live fully into this gospel experience, this good news experience on our own. That was never, ever the vision. That notion of this sort of individual piety, individual personal journey, that stuff is all Western European, individualistic notions that have played into many ways the ways in which we're right where we are right now in the world. So this sort of capitalism, this way in which it's easy to discard bodies and people and communities because it's much more important for the stock market for the individuals. That speaks to a hyper corrupt individualism that does not in any way align to the values and the sense of what the good news was about. It was always about a collective journeying. It was always about a proximity of people together, that it's not an I. And even in the biblical text, when you have scholars saying, when you have Paul and others saying you in English, what you don't hear, what you don't see that I see in the Greek is that's not a second person singular you individual. That's a second person plural. Y'all love God. Y'all love, so that my Kentucky comes out, right? So their envisioning of how we live out our faith is never an individual you. It is a collective you all. It is a togetherness. It's a togetherness on steroids that brings us to sort of new levels of consciousness and awareness and relationship that we're not used to. That makes us uncomfortable because a lot of us are not comfortable with that level of accountability, comfortable with that level of transparency. I'm not comfortable with you reminding me that I still have work to do, that there's still spots that I am blind to. After all this work I've done, you're telling me I'm still not there yet? No, girl, you ain't there yet. No. And vice versa. Like you tell me, I tell you. That's a real radical journeying that most of us are not comfortable with, but that is what's being asked of us. I'm gonna leave it there for a minute. I think I had another question. What was the other question? There was two other questions.
Accepting that there's a distinction between the gospel message and human and cultural claims, how might 21st century interpreters of the text identify which is which?
Yeah. So I think one of the ways in which we identify which is we recognize that we never come to the biblical text with a blank slate. That we already come. I mean, you don't read anything with the blank slate. That like there's already values and commitments, things that you hold on to that are there. Another way that I talk about it is you are never reading the Bible in a room by yourself, even when you're in a room. Like there is a boardroom in the room with you, whether you recognize it or not. So who are the voices that are in the room with you when you read the text that make you feel warm and fuzzy, and then the ones that don't, right? Like those are always in the room with you. And so one of the ways in the 21st century and the history, so where we are in this time of on this side of history is always a part of it too. So where you are in history and time, all these pieces go into reading biblical text. When we come to it in the 21st century, we have to start reading the text, recognizing there are ways in which the biblical text models uh, what the opportunities of our faith and the challenges of our faith. Like everything in the biblical text isn't meant to be for you to duplicate. So like, are you really going to go out there in the world and duplicate rape? Are you really going to go out there in the world and say that it's okay to go into a land and pretend like whole nations of people aren't there and kill them because you said, God, this is my land, really for me. Thank you for keeping it. Now you need to go about your way, or else. Like, I mean, there's certain things and stories that happen in biblical text that I'm actually, quite frankly, not interested in participating in. So the biblical text speaks to the full range of what it means to be human, the good, the bad, the ugly, the dangerous. And so to read the biblical text, recognizing this represents parts of of human living that I am not interested in duplicating. Now, where you see this sometimes, this goes back to you, Dr. Burns, where you can see the rub is when you get to those household codes. So a lot of times that tells me, a lot of times I loved, this tells me something about the situation of our communities or our leaders, because very, very quick to say no to slavery, but then you say nothing at all about the hierarchy between husband and wife. A lot of times I say, so you can't do it like that. Like the code is the code, the whole thing goes together. So either you're going to just say no to all of it, but you can't like take the part that allows you to stay in power or authority, or that allows you to, that seems familiar to you, and then discard the other. So there's a way in which we have to deal with the text in its entirety. A few minutes since I brought the household codes up, let me say something about that very quickly. The household codes were, again, these were sort of mirrors of the ancient Roman world that was being played out. Aristotle established this sort of code of hierarchy for how the Greeks were to set up their empire as they went all over the Mediterranean world, conquering it. So it's something that is inherited from the social culture. What is so interesting, a womanist Bible scholar who I love, Anne Redding Holmes, did work on the household codes along with Clarice Martin in the New Testament. And I find very interesting is Anne Redding Holmes' argument that the household codes were a sort of this accommodating compromise.
That was my Greek teacher. I got to do that throughout. She was my Greek teacher. Go ahead.
I was teaching Greek, and so she talks about how this becomes sort of the accommodating compromise that the early Christians were making, again, because they're navigating issues of annihilation, right? Of really whole communities being wiped out if they're too different from the larger society that they're situated in, with the understanding that they would come back to these codes, that they would come back to these and remedy this. Like, this is now, because there are real issues of life and death for the community. And so this is how we're going to navigate that. When I write about this in terms of First Peter and other spaces, I liken it to some of the decisions that were made at the level of the auction block for Black people. Like, our ancestors made decisions about what it meant to stay alive with the hope that the next generations would have would have liberation and would have freedom and would. So these are this life and death, communal life and death situations that are being navigated here. Do you like them? Are they right? I mean, we can haggle about all of that, but all of those decisions were all at all times being made with the understanding that God is even bigger than this decision. That that a real belief that this doesn't seal the deal on what God can do and who God can do it through. This is what we're doing right now for the outside world so that the community can stay vibrant and living and moving forward. I'm gonna leave it there because I could go even further with that.
Okay.
But the biggest piece is to say we need to read the biblical text, recognizing our commitments to communities, our commitments to each other, and then be okay with naming when texts are not as life-giving as other texts, right? That this doesn't speak to the values and the commitments are, but these do. There are 4 gospels for a reason, because Mark didn't get everything, right? So Mark doesn't give it to me, maybe I need to go to Luke. Luke doesn't give it to me, maybe I need to go to John. So the very construction of the New Testament speaks to the ways in which no single text, no single writing ever captures the fullness of God's revelation and God's work in the world. You got to have multiple witnesses, multiple testaments, multiple journeys in order to begin to even have a chance of keeping somewhat in pace behind God and God's Spirit.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for that. Dr. Smith, we have about good 3 minutes left, and we have this question that Yvonne Johnson asked. And so answer this for us as we as part of our closing comments. What are we women doing to take care of each other?
I hope we're talking to each other. Really, really talking to each other. Talking to each other includes listening to each other, whatever that may be. Um, especially during this time where we're all in different situations. I mean, one of the things that I find most, one of the things I love most about studying early Christianity is just realizing how much communication was flowing, because they were all working this stuff out, like I said, together in real time, right? And recognizing that in order to do that, they have to talk to each other, they have to be present with each other, they have to write to each other and say, "So yeah, I don't get that, Paul. Tell me, well, now what you mean about that? Because I don't know if I get that." I hope that we are talking to each other and journeying with each other, listening to each other.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for being with us on today. Thank you for delving into what is still such a hot topic, hot discussion, one that is still much debated because there are many women, especially who are listening to us on today, who are pastoring in areas where they're still not invited into the pulpit, that their ministries are still not recognized because of this, of saying that women shouldn't preach, you shouldn't be in the pulpit, you shouldn't be here, you can't pray, and so all of these things. And so there's still many that are listening live with us who will come back and listen to this broadcast later, who are struggling with that part of that identity of saying, God made me female. Conte Cullen said, "You bid me, why did you make me black and bid me to sing?"
Yeah.
You know, but here it is that God, you made me woman, and yet have bid me to preach. And so there are many who are struggling with that. And so I really, really appreciate today this very honest, scholarly approach
Yes.
to this topic on today. And we do hope that it is a blessing to someone who is listening. I know it has been a blessing to me. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dr. Smith, for being with us on today.
Thank you for having me.
So thank you so much.
Dr. Bradford, will you share with our people who
Yeah.
we have on next week?
No, next week is replay. Yeah.
Oh, wow, we're in September already.
Yes,
Oh
we're in
my
September
goodness.
already. The next few
Oh my
weeks.
goodness. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So we will have a rebroadcast as we have some wonderful people that are lined up in the future. But in the meantime, please make sure that you register to vote. You get someone else registered to vote. If you're going to vote by absentee ballot, go ahead and put those requests in now. And we again want to thank Dr. Smith for being with us today on Timely Wisdom. We
Yeah.
thank God for you. Continue to keep Dr. Sarita Wright and her
Yes.
daughter in your prayers. Continue to keep Dr. Brenda Wallace
Mhm.
in your prayers as she is recovering from COVID. We love you.
We'll
God
be back.
bless you.
We'll be
All
back
right,
live on September 15th.
on 15.
Yeah,
Yes. Dr. Carolyn McCrary
that's
will be
right.
with us on September the 15th. Dr.
Yes.
Carolyn McCrary out of the Interdenominational Theological Center.
Yeah.
And we are excited. God bless you.
God bless you. Love you all.